It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. To close out 2025, we're going to do the other adjunct member of the Universal Classic Monster series. By 1946, the Universal Classic Monster cycle concluded with House of Dracula's release in December of 1945. A few months later, and well ahead of the Abbott and Costello monster comedies, Universal had one more actual monster movie to release, She-Wolf of London. Now, I don't believe this is at all a sequel to 1935's Werewolf of London, but I think the idea was to call back to the earlier film's title with this one. Now, speaking of Abbott and Costello, this movie was directed by Gene Yarbrough. Now, Yarbrough did make movies like The Devil Bat and King of the Zombies, both cult classics, and the other 1946 Universal horror film House of Horrors starring Rondo Hatton. He also is known for directing a bunch of the Abbott and Costello films, as well as films in the Bowery Boys series. So later on in his career, he transitioned from B-movies to TV and even directed episodes of The Addams Family. Now, the lead in this movie is a young June Lockhart. Lockhart is probably best known for playing the mom in two classic television series, Lassie from 1958 to 1964, and Lost in Space from 1965 to 1968. After Lost in Space, she moved to Petticoat Junction to play Dr. Janet Craig for nearly 50 episodes. And 2 years before this movie, Lockhart was in the massively popular Meet Me in St. Louis with Judy Garland. But she was still looking for a breakout, and she didn't necessarily audition for this movie. This was something that her agent submitted on her behalf. I don't think she believes that she did a very good job in the movie, but she said that maybe she could have gotten a little more out of it if she had a slightly better direction or was given a little bit something more to do. And that's fair. She spends a lot of time in bed in this movie, but she does remember having a fun time making this movie. Now, of course, shortly after this movie, she'd break through on Broadway and later become one of the bigger TV stars for over a decade. We start the movie in early 20th century London. Of course, because this is She-Wolf of London, of course we're going to be in London, right? I mean, that only makes sense. But anyway, there is a nearly forgotten legend of the Allenby curse. And the police are going to investigate what the newspaper is calling a werewolf attack in a park. A man claims he was attacked by, for a lack of a better term, a feral woman. Detective Latham buys into the story of this being a werewolf attack. After all, the victim himself claims he saw a wolf-like woman, but Inspector Pierce doesn't believe it. He thinks the chap was just simply nicked by a dog. Now, meanwhile, the lovely Phyllis Allenby, played by June Lockhart, is preparing to get married to Barry Landfield, a barrister who works in partnership with his father, a much more experienced and much more famed barrister, as we find out later in the movie. But she overhears Latham and Pierce talking about the clues in the park about a woman's footprints being found around where this man was attacked, and Phyllis starts to get a little nervous, almost as if she knows more about the case being investigated than she lets on. Phyllis lives in a mansion near the park where the attack happened with her Aunt Martha and her cousin Carol. But there's a secret in the family. Phyllis is not actually related to Martha or Carol. Phyllis's father at one point was in love with Martha, but they went in separate directions to different suitors. Allenby married Phyllis's mother, and Martha married Carol's father. However, when Martha's husband died while Carol was still young, that left the family penniless. So she eventually moved into the Allenby mansion as the housekeeper. Now, the concern is once Phyllis marries Barry, she will likely have to move out, making it so that Carol and Martha may not have a home either. And she kind of thinks of herself as higher class. In fact, she really doesn't like Carol seeing a kind of a starving artist, kind of lower class guy who works at a grocery store, even though Carol's in love with him. She thinks that it would behoove her to find somebody of better status. But Martha owns a couple of guard dogs for the women's protection. However, the dogs constantly growl and bark at Phyllis. Later that night, patrolling police officers hear screaming in the park, and after they investigate, we see a woman in white return to the Allenby estate. When Phyllis wakes up the next morning, she has dried blood on her hands, and the bottom of her housecoat and her slippers have mud on them. She tells Martha that she thinks she's succumbing to the Allenby curse. Now, Martha believes that this is all hogwash, but at breakfast, Carol reads in the paper that a small child, I think they said the boy was 10 years old, was murdered in the park by what seemingly could be a wild animal. And the details of this is fairly grisly. Now, Barry comes to visit Phyllis, but she sends him away, claiming at least to her family that she cannot ever see him again based on what she thinks she did, at least what she tells what she tells Martha, what she did to a 10-year-old boy the night before. Now, Barry keeps wanting to come around to see Phyllis. After all, they're to be married next Wednesday, and Phyllis continues to push him away. Carol tries to convince Phyllis to confide in her. I mean, Carol's talked to Barry. They've gone riding together. He's spilling his guts about how he's feeling to her. And they both think whatever is bothering Phyllis has to be much more sinister than she's letting on. But Phyllis will not tell Carol anything other than just wanting to be left alone. Phyllis intends on staying up all night that night to fight whatever is going on with her, despite Martha still thinking that, she's taking all the supernatural superstition a little too seriously. Now, Latham comes to see who all might be living in the area, and particularly at the Allenby mansion. He's a little bit surprised that no men live with the 4 women. That's the 3 main women of the house, Martha, Carol, and Phyllis, and then the maid, Hannah. Now, he speaks to Martha about the murders and tells her that either an animal or person from the neighborhood is committing the murders. He's almost certain of it. And he still also believes that there's a werewolf running about. But later that same night, after Latham spoke to Martha, a woman in a white gown exits Allenby Mansion and goes into the park where Latham is patrolling looking for werewolves. And the woman stalks the detective and attacks him. Before dying, Latham tells the other patrolling constables that the quote-unquote wolf woman has done him in. The next morning, Martha wakes Phyllis up and discovers her white dress and shoes are muddied, and she has a bloodied gardening tool next to her bed. Oh, also, the door that Phyllis thought that she had locked to lock herself in was actually not locked when Martha came in that morning. Now, Phyllis finally tells Barry that she can't marry him due to this Allenby curse and what have you. And ever since her parents died, she's had dreams in which she took part in pagan rituals and transformed into a wolf and even hunted with the wolves. And Barry believes that she just heard the story of the curse at a young age, and then the trauma of her parents' deaths led to her having these dreams. I mean, she can't possibly believe that werewolves exist. But that night, Pierce, the other inspector, has a whole army of cops patrolling the park. A woman in a gown leaves the Allenby mansion, and Barry, who's hiding, follows. The woman in the gown sneaks up on a man in the park bench and attacks him. The man in the park is Carol's lower-class boyfriend, Dwight, and police chase after the woman who attacked Dwight. But the next day, Dwight visits Carol to ask her, Barry visits Carol to ask her some questions about, why was she sneaking out? Why is she going to see Dwight in these types of circumstances when they know that there's a murderer about? And why did she attack him? And he's kind of believing that she might be the quote-unquote she-wolf. Well, if she's not a she-wolf, she's very clearly possibly insane, because insane people may not remember everything they did during stressful situations. If she tried to attack Dwight, she may not remember that. She comes around the corner, pretends to be or at least reverts back to her normal self, and everything is just peachy keen and she has no memory of anything that she did. But when he's kind of laying this all out to Carol, she vehemently denies the accusation. But then Martha arrives and tells Barry that Phyllis is not able to see him because she's been terribly upset ever since their last meeting. Now, Martha believes that Phyllis and Barry will never marry. She tells Carol that Phyllis is, quite frankly, insane and probably should be committed. And that's the crux of all of this. That night, Phyllis tells Carol everything about how she thinks she's a werewolf and that she wants her to go to the police so that, they can investigate, even if that means that they may throw her into an asylum if she turns out to just be insane. Now, as Carol goes to the police, Martha visits Phyllis and gives her warm milk laced with something that will basically drug her to sleep. Martha plans to then kill Phyllis and make it look like a suicide. Hannah, outside in the hall, hears all of this. You see, Martha is the supposed she-wolf. There actually is no wolf at all. There's no werewolf. It's somebody who makes sounds like an animal, but is just killing people in vicious manners. And Martha did all of this to basically drive Phyllis insane, because once Martha realized that Phyllis believes in the Allenby curse, she could commit these crimes to make her believe that she's turning into a werewolf. Because if Phyllis married Barry, Martha would be forced out of the house that she loved living in. Carol would also likely marry someone beneath her status, like Dwight. She wanted to get Phyllis into an insane asylum, or at least out of the way, so that she could push Barry and Carol together. Barry, being above Carol's status as a barrister, would be somebody that she would approve of. And initially, it was only really to, get Phyllis into the asylum. But if Carol got the police there, this would open up an entirely different investigation that would then make it clear that Phyllis is actually totally sane. So Martha then has to make it look like Phyllis killed herself. And so when Hannah opened the door to Phyllis's room, that interrupted the whole thing, and Martha chased after her. And Hannah, as she's running down the stairs, tells Martha that she's going to get the cops. And Martha ends up stumbling down the stairs, and when she gets to the bottom, it's revealed that she's landed on the knife that she was carrying to stage the suicide and kill Phyllis. Martha dies as the police, Barry, Carol, and Dwight arrive at the mansion. All right, so let's talk about 3 things I like about She-Wolf of London. And this is actually kind of an interesting movie, and the 3 things that I like about it are mostly kind of front-loaded in this movie. But there are some things about this first that I'm going to talk about that does kind of pop up in the later part of the movie. But I start with something that I think would only really be a mild stretch. But I think this movie has something very interesting going on in between the lines of the plot. Now, granted, this was written by a man, but there are a lot of strange things that happen overnight to Phyllis. Now, if this was a male-centric story, you could say that this is a little bit of a stand-in for nocturnal emissions. But for a female-led cast, waking up with dried blood on your body, explicitly hands in this case, could also affect women of a certain age. So there could be a little bit of a read of Phyllis dealing with a menstrual cycle, right? Lycanthropy and menstrual cycles tend to both be 28 days. And I'm guessing some backwater hicks back in the old days often tried to tie lycanthropy to a girl on her period before more information about what was really going on was uncovered and kind of became common knowledge among the human race. Now, especially the first scene, when there is direct reference made to blood being on her hands, it seems like you might see a take on menstruation play out here. But of course, later on, it's a little bit different. There's family politics at play with what Aunt Martha wants for the 2 younger women living under the same roof with her. But that also brings in a little bit of conversation around trauma. later on. Seemingly, Phyllis only believes in the werewolf curse on her family because she heard that as a young child, and then when her parents both died, she got stuck on that being something that would befall her due to the stress and the trauma of losing her parents. So that's something that I actually kind of like. There's some things that you could read in between the lines, especially with the idea that after that first scene, I thought, oh, this is going to take a menstrual cycle direction, but it's really more about trauma and being kind of living under the reign of a controlling quote unquote aunt like Martha. But second, now you got to stick with me here. I like that the first death in the movie is actually a small child. I just stick with me here. Not some wino, not a cop, not the cousin or the aunt. It's a kid. And in 1946, under very strict censorship regulations, our lead actress, a young and pretty sweetheart type that Phyllis is portrayed as, might have, as the papers report, torn a child to shreds. Obviously, we don't see anything like that play out in the movie, but it's the implications that she might have killed a 10-year-old boy is not exactly the most common thing you think you're to see or hear about in a movie from that era. So there's a little bit of ballsiness with that first kill to make it a child and not some supporting character. Third, I really do like the light mystery element to this movie. So going a little bit one step back from that first it's fairly obvious that Martha is the so-called werewolf because she's so stern and at times comes off kind of cold, or she seems to be overly protective or overly wants her daughter to not be with a certain type of person and all of that stuff. But there's plenty in the first 15 or 20 minutes to add a little intrigue. Martha and Carol are thought to be related to Phyllis and therefore potentially Allenby's too, who could be subject to the fable curse if there actually is a werewolf in this movie, which there isn't. But Phyllis is nervous when the police is poking around the park, following up on the supposed werewolf attack of the man the night before at the very beginning of the movie. And she's superstitious about the dogs constantly barking at her. Now, of course, we can imply, or it could be assumed, that Martha specifically trained the dogs to bark at Phyllis directly, but I digress. Honestly, while this is hardly the most classic of the Universal horrors, it at least starts with a decent premise that adds a little extra mystery. And, many of the other classics from Universal wouldn't have had that because you would have a movie like The Wolfman or any of the Wolfman sequels. If you watch one of those movies, Lon Chaney Jr. is a werewolf and will turn into a werewolf, and there will be some unfortunate death around that. So I kind of like this little extra flavor that this movie has by kind of building this little mystery that it plays with, particularly in the first half of the movie. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Wednesday morning Film Seizure podcast and the Monday afternoon Monster Mondays podcast at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube, where we also upload these shows. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. And we move into 2026 with a little bit of a plan and a little bit of a programming update. For each of the first 7 months of the year, I'm going to focus on specific decades each month. They won't be in order, but each month I will talk about monster flicks from that decade. And I kick things off with the 2010s. But then, as we approach episode number 400 at the end of August, I will actually be bringing Monster Mondays to a close. I've had a blast doing this show and wanted to make sure that not only did I provide much more positivity about some of these movies aren't that good, but there's always something still that I've enjoyed about each one of these movies. And that's what I want to focus on. And that's one of the things that I did this show for. But I also kind of feel like now, as we get closer to that 400th episode next year, I think I've done what I was able to do with the show. So I wanted to make sure I tidy up some things and, select some movies that I wanted to make sure to cover before finishing the series. So I hope that what I've selected for each of the next several months and these last 35 episodes will be enjoyed as much as I've enjoyed doing this show each week for the past 7 full years. But join me next time as we kick off those final 35 episodes with 2018's Lake Michigan Monster. And until next week, stay spooky.